Hello and welcome back to another episode in a series of videos where I discuss Ottoman clothing and how historically accurate the costumes in a TV drama called The Magnificent Century were. I just like to put a disclaimer out there because I think I ruffled a few feathers with my previous video where I kind of roasted the women's costumes on the show. I'm not a fashion critic. My intention is not to critique how beautiful, thought-provoking, unique, creative the costume design was. I don't really care about the reasoning behind why they did the costumes a certain way or why they chose certain colors. I'm a historian. I just relay the facts. If you don't like it, that's just too bad, because history is under no obligation to be molded or changed according to a modern person's beliefs or their ideals or what they're interested in. That being said, I'm not targeting any specific designers or producers or historians that worked on the show. They must have had their own reasons as to why they chose to depict the costumes so far from what they really were in the 16th century. Actually, somebody had left a comment in the previous video saying that the designers knew that they weren't being historically accurate and that they actually intended to blend a lot of historical and non-historical elements to appeal to modern audiences. Yes, it's right. Magnificent Century has a worldwide audience that has no idea about Ottoman fashion, and they may have not been able to connect with the actual true fashion of that time. However, that would have been like a great opportunity to teach people about this topic. Anyway, in the last video, we took a look at the silhouettes, fabrics, textiles of the 1520s to around the 1540s. I didn't discuss the headwear, which is a major element of fashion at the time. It didn't only have decorative, but it also had socio-political significance. As is the case for women's clothing from the time, we have very little extant garments, so garments that were produced in that time and have come down to us. So the designers would have relied heavily on miniatures, European artists' paintings, travelogues, and there are truly a lot of paintings of the sultanas and the princesses in the harem. The issue with this is that the harem in the 1500s was very restrictive and had very strict rules about who could enter and who could physically see and have contact with the women in there. This means that court painters and European artists who painted these women didn't actually see them. They didn't have a first-hand view, so what they have painted comes from their imagination. It comes from maybe women they saw on the streets, or in the case of European artists, it's inspired by the clothing of Western European royal women. It seems that the designers were very inspired by these European portraits. Especially those of Hürrem, the wife of Sultan Süleyman. This is actually one of my favorite headpieces in the show. I think it is stunning. It looks exactly like one of the woodcut portraits of Hürrem, and this portrait is from the 1540s. Again, the artist never saw her, never saw what she wore. He was likely taking inspiration from European fashion. No such crown exists in the Topkapi Palace or was found in Hürrem's mausoleum. It hasn't been found in any private collections. So personally, I'm leaning more towards this is an acceptable design choice, because at least we see this style in portraits from that time. It's not unthinkable that she would have worn something of that, roughly of that shape and size. And we know that women's headwear often had precious jewels and gemstones attached to them. Sadly, I can't say the same for the other 95% of women's headwear in the show. These are just purely based on fantasy. They look like something that you would see in a Renaissance fair or in like Lord of the Rings. That being said, I love them. I think they're gorgeous. They're not tacky or over the top, but there's simply no evidence that such headwear was worn in the Ottoman court in the 1520s or 30s. These are more ornamental and beautiful, whereas headwear during that time really had multiple purposes. The head was another part of the body that was considered inappropriate to show. It wouldn't only cover the hair for modesty, but also headwear was a huge indicator of social status and rank, especially in court. Ideas of honor and respectability were all tied to your headwear. And it's something that modern audiences, especially in the West, really struggle to understand, because no one really wears headwear anymore unless it's protective. Like we wear hats when it's sunny, or we wear beanies when it's cold. And then there are these pieces that are just so anachronistic, meaning they've been taken from another period and just plopped into a 16th century context and it doesn't work. Regardless of how pretty they are, they're really costumey. They are closer to the crowns that Ottoman women in the 19th century would wear. For example, this is Princess Fatma, the half-sister of Sultan Murad in 1870. This intricate metalwork, the gemstone placing, the diamonds, etc. are definitely closer to 19th century fashion than 16th century. Also, there is so much variety, like why? The harem would have bankrupted the entire Ottoman state if every single woman had a different diamond crown for every day of the year. That brings up an important point in these medieval and historical dramas, is that they don't take into account that there was no mass production. There was no fast fashion. This was before the Industrial Revolution. There were no factories that could mass produce these things. Some of Hürrem's own jewelry was made by her husband Sultan Suleiman, who was a very skilled jeweler. And the process of creating these was painstaking. It would have taken a very long time. Like I mentioned in my previous video, a lot of the costumes in Magnificent Century are kind of dangerously close to items that we would find online, like on Etsy, and some of them just outright look like something from a medieval fantasy TV show like Game of Thrones. Like, it looks like she has little tentacles coming out. Like, come on. Another really important element of 16th century headwear were veils. A lot of the veils in this show and in a lot of other Turkish dramas are just slap bam, like stuck to the head, which is definitely not the way that upper class women would wear them. Veils were almost always attached to a type of headwear called a başlık, which is just the general word for the headwear. Whether they were smaller fez type pieces or a larger, more conical arakçın, like that of Hanzade Sultan from 1620. There are scenes where you see more appropriate headwear, like some of the servants are wearing these little caps. So that was really great to see. And this one in particular, I really love it. I really can't fault it in any way. It's the perfect height, perfect shape, the gold floral embroidery, and the red color is very period appropriate. Also, this one is probably one of the most accurate pieces that I have seen in this entire show. You have the başlık or tarpush kind of hanging over her forehead, which is very accurate, and then you have the veil on top. In a lot of depictions from that time, we see this headwear, and some would make the argument that the harem context meant that there were no men and they could dress however they wanted, and they were a bit more free, but this is simply not true. We know that because we have extant başlıks, so the headwear from that time. This, for example, belonged to Ayşe Sultan in the 1580s. Although it belongs to, a period a few decades after Hürrem's time, Ottoman fashion changed really slowly. It did not progress the same way that European fashion did. And in fact, according to Hülya Tezcan, who is a very important scholar in the field of Ottoman fashion, she was actually the former curator of textiles at Topkapı Palace Museum. She notes that towards the mid-16th century, women's headwear wouldn't pass about 10 centimeters, and it was very flat, kind of fez-like. And this is corroborated by drawings from that period, like this one from 1555, or this one from 1588. And this brings me to another important point. The extant headwear that we have and the artist's depictions always show that headwear was made out of some type of fabric. Ayşe Sultan's başlık, for example, was made out of a silk brocade with carnations on it. Just like with the clothing, the fabric used for the headwear indicated social status, indicated how wealthy you were. Hats were also embellished with precious stones and a veil, and something very, very important called a kaşbastı, which was a veil band. It was actually kind of like a band this thick, and it would sit just kind of under the hat, around the head, just above the eyebrows. We are lucky enough to have several kaşbastı pieces from Hürrem's tomb. These were actually Hürrem's own kaşbastı. So we know that if she's wearing this, she is wearing a hat or she's wearing a başlık. So this is definitely something that they could have incorporated. You can keep the same hat and change the kaşbastı, change the veil, and that adds a bit more, what's that word? Variety. And especially in the royal court, they love to use something called a sorguç. We have Hürrem's own aigrettes, and they're preserved in the Museum of, I believe it was Islamic art. This is also one of Hürrem's, and it has hooks, so it's clearly attached to some kind of hat. These kind of extant things that we have are very different to the things we see in the show, which are mainly like kind of silver metallic items, most of which are in the form of a modern tiara. Headwear like the tarpush, the arakçın, was such an important part of courtly dress in the 16th century that leaving them out was a big mistake on the part of the production team. They left a major element out. So overall, I do think they could have done a better job. We should have seen more headwear in this style. However, after the grossly inaccurate clothing, you know, it's a breath of fresh air that we get some examples that are more period appropriate. What do you think? Do you think they could have done a better job? They could have incorporated these elements, or were you happy with all the metallic tiaras? As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next roast. Bye!